In the summer of 1974, a drilling rig came down the gravel road into Clara Hadley's farmyard like a bad omen on wheels. The rig belonged to Russell Thorne. Russell Thorne was the best well driller in the Missouri Ozarks, and everybody in Shannon County knew it. 20 years he'd been punching holes in limestone and dolomite across southern Missouri. He drove a $60,000 rotary drilling rig that could bore through solid rock to 400 feet. He kept a shelf of geological survey maps in the cab of his truck, neatly folded, annotated in pencil, cross-referenced with aquifer charts from the State Geological Office in Rolla. When Russell Thorne told you there was water beneath your property, you wrote the check for the well casing and the pump. When Russell Thorne told you there wasn't, you believed him the way you believed a doctor who'd looked at the x-ray and shaken his head. The diagnosis came from instruments and education and 20 years of being right, and there was no appeal. He'd arrived on a Monday morning, set up the rig in the farmyard, leveled the platform, checked the drill, String consulted his maps. Clara Hadley had watched from the porch, arms folded, saying nothing because there was nothing to say until the man finished his work. You don't talk to a surgeon while he's cutting. Russell drilled 3 test holes, 200 feet each, 600 feet of boring into the spine of an Ozark ridge, while the July sun turned the farmyard into a furnace, and the dust from the drill hung in the air like flour. He hit solid dolomite at 80 feet, fractured limestone below that, and below that, more dolomite dry as chalk, tight as a fist holding nothing. He climbed down from the rig on Wednesday afternoon and found Clara waiting by the barn. He pulled off his leather gloves and didn't make small talk because Russell Thorne did not believe in softening bad news. Bad news didn't improve with a cushion under it. There's no water here, Mrs. Hadley. Not at any depth my rig can reach. I drilled 3 holes to 200 feet and hit solid dolomite and dry fracture zones the whole way down. The geological survey maps confirm what I found. This ridge sits above the regional water table. You're on top of a hill made of rock that doesn't hold water. Clara listened. She was 51 years old, 5'4", 120 pounds of Ozark bone and Baptist stubbornness. She'd learned a long time ago that when a man is telling you something he believes is true, the worst thing you can do is argue before he's finished. Let him say it all, then decide what it means. What do I do? She asked. You can pipe water from the valley. There's a producing well on the Langston Place, 3 miles east. You'd need to run a line and install a pump station. Cost you about $8,000. I don't have $8,000. Then you can haul water, or you can sell the cattle and farm dry, or you can sell the place. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hadley. This ridge doesn't have water. That's not an opinion. That's what the rock says. Russell loaded his rig onto the flatbed trailer, secured the drill string, checked the hitch. He drove away down the gravel road, trailing a plume of dust that hung in the still air like a sentence that hadn't quite ended, and Clara watched until the dust settled and the sound of his engine faded, and the silence of the ridge came back thick and dry and absolute. She stood in the farmyard looking at the 3 drill holes. Neat round openings in the earth, 6 inches across 200 feet deep, bone dry. 3 tiny punctures in the skin of the ridge that had found nothing because they were looking in the wrong place in the wrong way, though. Clara didn't know that yet. What she knew was simpler. Russell Thorne had just pronounced her land dead, and Harlan Moss was going to call. Let me tell you about the farm, because you need to understand what Clara stood to lose before you can understand what she decided to do about it. The property was 160 acres on an Ozark ridge outside of Eminence, Missouri. Shannon County, the most sparsely populated county in the state. A landscape of limestone bluffs and spring-fed rivers and hollows so deep the sun only reached the bottom for a few hours a day. Beautiful country if you were canoeing the current river or camping at Round Spring. Hard country if you were trying to make a living from it. Clara and her husband Hollis had bought the place in 1963 from a widow who was moving to Springfield. $4,000 for land nobody else wanted because nobody else wanted to farm a hilltop where the soil was thin and the timber was scrub oak and the water was seasonal. The farm had a cistern that caught rainwater off the roof of the barn and a creek that ran from February to June and went dry every summer like a promise the land couldn't keep. For 11 years they'd managed. Hauled water from a neighbor's spring 2 miles down the road during the dry months, filling 50-gallon drums in the back of the pickup and driving them home over the gravel road slowly so the water wouldn't slosh out, rationed what the cistern held, prayed in July and August when the cattle needed water most and the sky was copper and empty, and the forecast was always the same, which was no forecast at all, because in the Ozarks the weather does what it wants, and prayer is the only weather service that takes requests. They ran 28 head of Hereford cattle beef stock, good bloodlines the foundation of the farm's income. They kept a vegetable garden that fed the household from May through October. They lived simply and worked constantly and owed the bank $1,100 on the property, which they paid down month by month, never missing, because Hollis believed you paid what you owed and you owed nobody an explanation for how you lived. Then Hollis died. It happened in October of 1972. A Farmall Super M tractor, the same one that sat in the barn right now, threw a front wheel on a slope in the north pasture. The terrain was uneven. The wheel hit a limestone outcrop hidden in the grass, the spindle sheared, and the tractor rolled. 8,000 pounds of cast iron and a man who weighed 170. The tractor won. Hollis was 49 years old. He died in a field he'd plowed 100 times, killed by a machine he'd trusted for 20 years, on a Tuesday afternoon in October when the sky was clear and the air smelled like fallen leaves and nothing in the world seemed dangerous. Clara found him at supper time when he didn't come in. She walked the half-mile to the north pasture in her apron and her house shoes, following the tractor tracks through the stubble, and found the Farmall on its side in the ditch at the bottom of the slope and Hollis beneath it, already gone, his hand still on the steering wheel, as though he'd been trying to hold on. As though holding on could have saved him from 8,000 pounds of gravity. She buried him in the Baptist cemetery in Eminence next to his mother and his father, and 3 generations of Shannon County dead who lay in limestone soil waiting for the resurrection or the rain, whichever came first. The preacher said the words. The neighbors brought casseroles. The John Deere dealer in Eminence, a man named Dale Prescott, sent a flower arrangement with a card that said, "With deepest sympathy," in gold script, and Clara put the flowers on the kitchen table and the card in the drawer and went back to work, because the cattle needed feeding and the fence in the west pasture still needed mending, and grief does not excuse a farmer from the obligations of the living. For 2 years she ran the place alone. Her son Jesse was 14 when Hollis died. 16 now, a quiet boy who had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and moved through the world with the careful uncertainty of a young man who'd lost the person who was supposed to teach him how to be one. Jesse helped with the chores before school and after. He didn't complain. He didn't quit. But Clara could see the way he looked down the gravel road toward Eminence, toward the highway, toward Springfield and Street, Lewis and Kansas City, and everywhere that wasn't 160 acres of dry Ozark Ridge where his father had died under a tractor on a Tuesday afternoon. Jesse wanted to leave. He'd never said it out loud. He didn't need to. Clara could read her son the way her father had taught her to read the land. The signs were there if you knew how to look. A boy who didn't talk about the farm's future. A boy who kept the road atlas in his bedroom. A boy who flinched every time the Farmall Super M turned over in the barn, the sound of the engine a reminder of the machine that had killed the man who was supposed to be driving it. Now it was July of 1974. 2 years since Hollis. 11 years on the ridge, and the drought had come. Not an ordinary dry spell. Not the kind of summer where you haul a few extra loads and pray a little harder and the rain comes in September and you forget by October. This was the drought that made old men sit on the porches of feed stores in Eminence and talk about the Dust Bowl. The creek on Clara's property had gone dry in April instead of June. 2 months early, the stream bed cracked and white like a scar on the landscape. The cistern was empty by May, and the neighbor's spring, 2 miles down the road, the one that had never failed in living memory, the one the oldest men in the county swore had run even in 34, when everything else stopped, slowed to a trickle in June and stopped entirely in July. For the first time in her life, Clara Hadley had no water. Not reduced water, not rationed water, no water. 28 head of cattle standing in the pasture with their ribs starting to show their heads down their tails still. A vegetable garden turning brown at the edges, the tomatoes splitting the beans withered on the vine. A household of 2, herself and Jesse, and not a drop coming from anywhere except the gallon jugs she'd been buying at the grocery in Eminence, rationing them the way a castaway rations a canteen. She'd called Russell Thorne because Russell was the answer. The professional solution. The man with the machine and the maps who found water for a living and got paid whether he found it or not. He'd come and he'd drilled and he'd found nothing, and now he was gone, and Claire was standing in her farmyard in July with 3 dry holes in the ground and a decision to make. She went inside, made supper, cornbread and beans from the pantry cooked with water from the last gallon jug, said grace over the meal the way she always did, though what she was praying for had shifted from gratitude to something closer to negotiation. She ate across the table from Jesse in a silence that was heavier than the heat. Jesse spoke first. He almost never did. What did Russell say? No water. Not at any depth he can reach. What are we going to do? Clara looked at her son. He was 16 and afraid, though he'd have died before admitting it. Not afraid of the drought or the empty cistern or the cattle. Afraid of the same thing Clara was afraid of. That the ridge had finally beaten them. That Hollis had died on a farm that was going to die after him, and the dying would just take longer and hurt worse. I don't know yet, she said. She washed the dishes, sat on the porch as the light died and the ridge turned from brown to black against a sky that held not a single cloud and no promise of anything. The air was still and hot and smelled like dust and dry grass and the slow death of a farm that was running out of time. Harlan Moss called on Thursday. Harlan ran the savings and loan in Eminence. Tall man, clean fingernails. Wore a tie every day, including Sunday, and spoke about money the way a Baptist preacher speaks about sin with authority and a certain private satisfaction in other people's trouble. He didn't create trouble. He just positioned himself to benefit from it, which is a different thing legally and the same thing morally. But morality is a luxury in a drought, and Harlan Moss dealt in necessities. Clara drove to the bank, parked the pickup on Main Street, the same Ford with the cracked windshield that Hollis had bought in 68 200,000 miles on it, the transmission grinding in second gear. She walked into the air-conditioned lobby and sat across from Harlan in his office while the rest of the county baked. Mrs. Hadley, I understand Russell Thorne drilled your property this week. He did, and the results were not favorable. He didn't find water. No. Harlan folded his hands on his desk. He had a way of folding his hands that made you feel like you were the last item on an agenda that had already been decided. I've been reviewing your account. You're current on your payments, which I appreciate. But I have to be candid. A farm without water in a drought year is a depreciating asset. The cattle can't survive without a water source. The crops can't grow. The property value is declining daily. If this drought continues through next year, and the long-range forecast suggests it may, you'll be operating at a loss that exceeds your ability to service the debt. Clara waited. She'd learned that from Hollis, too. Let a man talk himself to the bottom. The bottom is where the truth is. I'd like to offer you an option. The bank would be willing to purchase your property directly at current fair market value. Appraisal puts it at $6,000. That's enough to clear your outstanding balance, leave you with a modest surplus, and give you the opportunity to start fresh somewhere with a reliable water source. $6,000. The farm had been worth $12,000 2 years ago before the drought, before Hollis, before Russell Thorne drilled 3 dry holes and made the ridge officially dead ground. Harlan was offering her half of what she'd had for land that would be worth double again the day the drought broke, and they both knew it. You're offering me half what the place is worth. I'm offering you half what the place was worth. Current value reflects current conditions. 160 acres of dry ridge with no water source, no producing well, and a drought that shows no sign of ending. That's not $12,000 land, Mrs. Hadley. That's land that's costing you money every day you hold it. Clara looked at Harlan Moss. She'd known him 20 years. He was exactly what he'd always been. A man who understood the price of everything and the value of very little. He wasn't cruel, he was arithmetic. And the arithmetic said Clara Hadley was finished. I'll think about it, she said. Don't think too long. The cattle won't wait. She drove home, parked in the farmyard, sat in the cab of the pickup with the engine off and both windows down and the heat pressing in like a hand on her chest. She looked at the ridge, her ridge, the ground Hollis had plowed and Jesse had been born on, and her father Emmett had walked with her when she was a girl, teaching her things she'd half forgotten until this moment. Emmett Hadley. Let me tell you about Emmett Hadley because he is the reason Clara did not call Harlan Moss back. He is the reason this story has a different ending than the one Russell Thorne predicted and Harlan Moss was banking on. Every life turns on a hinge, and Clara's hinge was a dead man's voice in her memory, saying things about sycamores and frost and the language the land speaks when nobody's listening. Emmett was born in 1898 in Shannon County, Missouri. He never left, never went to school past the 6th grade, never read a geological survey or studied an aquifer map or looked at a cross-section diagram of Ozark limestone. He married a woman named Ruth from the next hollow over a woman who could shell a bushel of black walnuts in an afternoon and quote scripture from memory and tolerate a husband who spent more time talking to the ground than to her. He farmed a small piece of bottom land near the current river, 40 acres of creek bottom soil that grew corn and sorghum and didn't require much in the way of irrigation. And he dug wells, not drilled, dug, by hand, with a pick, a shovel, a pry bar, and a 5-gallon bucket on a rope for hauling debris. The Hadleys were well diggers. 3 generations of them stretching back to the 1850s when Emmett's grandfather had homesteaded in the Ozarks on a land grant and dug the first wells in Shannon County with nothing but the tools he'd carried from Tennessee, and the knowledge of where to dig that came not from any book or map, but from watching the land. The Hadleys had a method, not a machine, not a survey, a method. They called it reading the ridge, and it had been passed from father to son for 70 years, each generation adding to it, the way each generation of water adds to the mineral deposits in a cave slowly, imperceptibly, until what you have is something substantial and old and entirely invisible to anyone who hasn't been inside. The method was simple to describe and extraordinarily difficult to practice. You walked the land, you looked at the trees, you watched the frost, you found the seeps. And from those signs, you determined where to dig. Not where the map said the water should be, where the land said the water was. Let me explain the science, because the science is real, even though the men who discovered the method never called it science. They called it common sense. They called it paying attention. They called it doing what your father did, which is the oldest form of empirical knowledge on Earth. The Ozark Plateau is karst geology. Limestone and dolomite hundreds of feet thick, riddled with ponds and sinkholes and spring and underground rivers carved by millions of years of water-dissolving stone. The Ozarks are one of the great karst landscapes of North America, and the water that moves through them behaves differently than water in ordinary rock. In sedimentary formations in sandstone and shale, and the neat, predictable layers that geologists love, water sits in a water table, a horizontal plane. You drill down, you hit the water table, you install a pump, you're done. The geological survey maps show where the water table is, and the driller follows the map, and the system works because the water cooperates. In karst, the water table is a fiction, an approximation, a line on a map that represents an average of a system that has no average. Water in karst doesn't sit in layers. It moves through fractures, through channels, through caverns, dissolved into the rock over geological time. The water is there. The Ozarks are full of it. Some of the largest springs in North America emerge from Ozark limestone, millions of gallons per day, pouring out of the rock as if the earth itself were bleeding. But the water moves through specific pathways, specific fractures, specific channels, and a drill bit might pass within 10 feet of a flowing underground river and never know it. The bit goes through solid stone on one side of the fracture and solid stone on the other side, and the driller logs the hole as dry, and the map says dry, and everyone agrees the ridge has no water. But the water is there, in the fracture between the drill holes, flowing in the dark, invisible to any instrument that doesn't happen to intersect the specific crack in the specific rock at the specific depth where the flow exists. Russell Thorne's 3 test holes had punched through solid dolomite and fractured limestone without hitting a water-bearing fracture. His 6-inch drill bit had passed through the rock like a needle through fabric, fast and precise. And if the fracture was 12 inches to the left or 20 inches to the right, the needle missed the thread, and the driller logged the fabric as solid and moved on. That didn't mean there was no water on Clara's ridge. It meant the drill had missed the fractures. In karst geology, drilling for water is like throwing darts at a target in a dark room. You might hit the bullseye. You might hit the wall, and you'll never know how close you came to the bullseye unless you tear the wall down and look. The Hadley method reading the ridge was a way of finding the target without throwing darts, a way of turning the lights on in the dark room dimly and perfectly, but enough to see the general shape of where the bullseye was. Emmett had taught Clara the signs when she was a girl. She was 12 the first time he took her out. A Saturday morning in October, frost on the ground, the air sharp enough to taste. Emmett told Ruth he was taking the girl for a walk, and Ruth said don't keep her past noon. And Emmett said they'd be back when the land was done, showing them what it wanted to show, which might be noon and might be supper time, because you can't put a clock on what the earth has to say. They walked the ridges together. Not quickly. Emmett never walked quickly on a ridge. He moved the way water moves through limestone, following every crack, reading every contour, stopping where the ground told him to stop. He was a small man, weathered and brown, with hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same dolomite he spent his life digging through. He spoke slowly, and he listened to the land faster than he listened to people, which Ruth had learned to accept and Clara had learned to admire. You see that sycamore, Emmett said. Clara saw it, a single tree growing on a hillside where everything else was blackjack oak and red cedar and scrub pine. The sycamore stood alone, tall and pale-barked, its leaves broad and green even in late October, when the oaks had already gone bronze and the cedars were dusted with dry needles. The tree looked like it belonged somewhere else, near a creek, near a river, not on a dry Ozark ridge a mile from the nearest surface water. Sycamores need water, Emmett said. Not seasonal water, not rain, deep water, reliable water. A sycamore puts its roots down 20, 30 feet and finds what's there. Other trees can't do it. Other trees take what the soil gives them and make do. A sycamore goes looking for what the soil is hiding. A sycamore growing on a dry ridge is a sign. It means the ridge isn't dry, not down deep, not where the roots go. It means there's water below that the tree found and nobody else knows about. How do you know it's not just catching rainwater? Look at the size of it. Look at how green it is this late in the year. Everything else is shutting down for winter. That sycamore is still growing, still drinking. It's got a source that doesn't depend on the season. The rain stops and the creeks dry up and the cisterns go empty, and that sycamore keeps drinking because its water comes from a place the drought can't reach. They walked on. Emmett stopped at a place on the ground where the frost had melted in a long, narrow strip, a dark line in the white field running roughly north to south across the hillside. See that frost melted there first. Days before the rest of the ground. Temperature differential. The ground is warmer along that line because there's water moving below, maybe 20 feet down, maybe 30. The water holds heat from the summer. Heat rises through the rock. Frost melts. You come out early enough in the morning, early enough in the season, and you can read the fracture lines in the frost pattern the way you read a road on a map. He took her to a limestone outcrop on the east face of a ridge and pointed to a dark streak on the gray stone. The streak wasn't wet, wasn't dripping, just dark. A stain where something damp had touched the rock and left its ghost. That's a seep, Emmett said. Moisture wicking out of a fracture in the stone and evaporating. Not enough to flow, not enough to drip, just enough to leave a mark. That mark tells you the rock is cracked and water is moving through the crack. In a dry year, the seep is all you'll see. In a wet year, it might flow. But the stain is always there because the water is always moving, even when there's not enough of it to break the surface. Follow the seep line upslope, and you'll find where the fracture crosses another fracture. Where they cross, that's where you dig. Not drill dig. A drill bit is 6 inches wide. It punches through rock like a needle through cloth. Fast and precise, and it'll miss a fracture by 2 feet and never touch it. A hand-dug well is 4 feet across. Opens a cross-section of rock 8 times wider than a drill hole. If there's a fracture within reach, within 2 feet of your center line, you'll find it. A drill might not. That's the difference. The drill is a needle. The well is a window, and when you're looking for something hidden, you want a window, not a needle. Clara was 12. She listened the way 12-year-olds listen, which is to say she remembered the sycamore and forgot the frost and half understood the seep and didn't grasp any of it fully until 40 years later when she needed it. There was one more thing Emmett told her that morning. They were walking back toward the truck, the sun higher now, the frost gone, the ridges golden with late October light. Emmett stopped and looked at the hills the way he always looked at them, with a tenderness that Clara didn't understand until she was old enough to love a piece of ground herself. Water leaves tracks, Emmett said, even when you can't see it. Even when the ground looks dry and the drill says dry and the map says dry, the water is there. It's always been there. It's talking to you. Every tree that grows where it shouldn't, every frost line that melts too early, every stain on a rock face. Those are the water's words. You just have to learn the language. Emmett died in 1967. Heart attack in his garden on a Sunday afternoon, quick and clean, the way he'd have wanted if anyone had asked. He was 69. Clara was 44, married to Hollis, living on the ridge. She mourned her father and moved on and didn't think about reading the ridge for years because they had the cistern and the creek and the neighbor's spring, and water was a thing they managed, not a thing they solved. Until now. Now she was sitting in the pickup truck in her farmyard looking at 3 dry drill holes in a ridge that Russell Thorne had pronounced dead and Harlan Moss wanted to buy for half its worth, and the voice she heard in her head wasn't Hollis's and wasn't Jesse's and wasn't Russell Thorne's. It was Emmett's, clear as the October morning he'd said it 40 years ago, frost melting along a line that nobody else could see. The water is there. It's talking to you. You just have to learn the language. Clara got out of the truck. She walked the ridge, not quickly, slowly. The way Emmett had moved, following the contours, reading the ground, stopping where the land told her to stop. She walked every contour line from the ridge top to the tree line on the northwest slope, looking for the signs. And the ridge, which Russell Thorne had declared dry and Harlan Moss was trying to buy for $6,000, began to speak. She found the sycamore first. It was 200 feet from the farmhouse on the northwest slope below the ridge line. A single mature sycamore, tall and broad canopied, its bark white and mottled in the afternoon light, its leaves green. Now the exhausted, dusty green of the oaks and cedars that were hanging on through the drought. A living green, a drinking green, the green of a tree with a source that the drought could not reach. It was growing in a spot where no sycamore had any business existing. The ridge was dry. Russell Thorne had said so. The Geological Survey had said so. 3 drill holes, 200 feet deep, had said so. But the sycamore was alive. Its roots had found something that 600 feet of test drilling had missed. The tree was evidence. Living, growing, photosynthesizing evidence that the ridge was not what the map said it was. Clara walked to the sycamore and put her hand on the bark. It was cool. Even in July, even in the baking heat that was killing everything else on the ridge, the bark was cool the way the bark of a tree near water is cool. She could feel it against her palm, a temperature that came from below, from the roots, from whatever the roots had found in the dark. She looked for the secondary signs, the frost pattern. She'd seen it in January 6 months earlier, without understanding what it meant. A patch of ground near the sycamore's base where the frost had disappeared 3 days before the surrounding ground cleared. She'd noticed it while feeding the cattle one morning, the way you notice a thing, without registering it, filing it away in the part of memory that stores observations you don't yet have a use for. Now she had a use. Temperature differential. Groundwater warmth rising through a fracture. Her father's voice, heat rises, frost melts. The fracture line runs underneath that patch of ground, and the water in the fracture keeps the ground warm enough to melt the frost 3 days before the rock around it. The seep. She found it 12 feet downslope from the sycamore, a dark streak on a limestone outcrop. Not wet, not dripping, just dark. A stain on gray rock where moisture was wicking out of a crack in the stone and evaporating in the summer air. In a normal year, the seep would have been invisible, lost in the general dampness of the season. But 1974 was a drought year, the worst in memory, and everything on the ridge was dry. Everything except this single dark streak on this single rock face below this single sycamore tree. The seep stood out like a whisper in a silent room. Clara stood between the sycamore and the seep and looked at the ground and felt something shift in her chest. Not certainty, something before certainty, something older. Recognition. The land was speaking the language her father had taught her, and after 40 years of forgetting, she could hear it again. She marked the spot. 6 feet upslope from the seep directly below the sycamore, at the convergence of the frost pattern and the vegetation marker. That was where the fractures crossed. That was where the water would be. Russell Thorne had drilled his 3 test holes on the flat top of the ridge, the highest point where the geological survey maps indicated the most likely aquifer access. He drilled where the maps told him to drill, where the science said to look, where 20 years of professional experience in a $60,000 rig and a shelf full of charts all pointed. Clara was going to dig where the land said to dig, 200 feet downslope from Russell's holes, on the side of the ridge instead of the top, in a spot that no geological survey had ever marked because no geologist had ever asked a sycamore for directions. And the land was telling a different story than the maps. She walked back to the farmhouse. Jesse was on the porch steps sharpening a fence tool with a file the way Hollis had taught him, long, slow strokes, the sound of metal on metal in the still air. He looked up when Clara came around the corner and saw something in her face that made him stop. "What is it? I'm going to dig a well." Jesse stared at her. The file hung motionless in his hand. "Mama, Russell Thorne drilled 3 holes, 200 feet each. He said there's no water on this ridge. Russell drilled. I'm going to dig." Those are different things. Different how? Different in every way that matters. Your grandfather would have understood. He never drilled a hole in his life. He opened the rock and looked at what was inside. Jesse was quiet. He didn't argue. He'd learned that arguing with his mother when she had the look was like arguing with the weather. It didn't change anything, and it wore you out. The look was something he'd seen more often since Hollis died. It was stubbornness, yes, but it was something else too, something he couldn't name. The expression of a woman who had already lost one thing she couldn't afford to lose and was not going to lose another. But he could see the doubt in her eyes too, underneath the determination, the way you can see the current under the surface of still water if you look long enough. She wasn't certain. She was choosing to act in the absence of certainty, which is not the same thing as being sure and is in many ways harder. Clara went to the barn. She took down the tools. Hollis's pick, Hollis's shovel, Hollis's pry bar, the 5-gallon bucket, and the coil of rope. Tools that were old when Hollis bought them at an auction in Winona. Older than that, probably the kind of tools that circulate in farming country for generations, because good steel doesn't wear out, and neither does the need for a man or a woman to break rock. She carried them to the marked spot on the northwest slope, set them down in the grass beside the sycamore, looked up at the tree, its canopy wide against the sky, its leaves shifting in a breeze that was too slight to feel on the ground. Tomorrow she would start. She was going to dig a well by hand. In July. In a drought. In solid rock. On a ridge that a professional driller had declared dry. Because a sycamore was growing where no sycamore should grow, and her father had taught her what that meant. The bank wanted her land. The drought wanted her cattle. The geology, according to the maps, wanted her gone. Clara picked up the shovel, tested its weight, set it down. Tomorrow, she walked back to the house, made supper, said grace, ate across the table from Jesse in a silence that was different from the silence of the past 2 years. Not the silence of loss, the silence of decision, the silence of a thing about to begin. She washed the dishes, sat on the porch in the dark. The ridge was black against a sky full of stars, and the air smelled of dust and dry grass, and somewhere beneath her, 30 feet down in a fracture in the dolomite that no drill bit had touched and no map had recorded, cold water waited. The sycamore knew. Nobody had asked it. Not yet. Clara started digging on the 12th of July, 1974. She woke before dawn, before tamam. The house was dark and Jesse was sleeping, and the ridge was silent in the way the Ozarks are silent in the hour before the birds wake, which is not true, silence but a held breath, the whole landscape waiting to see what kind of day it's going to be. She dressed, work boots, the leather cracked at the toes. Canvas trousers she'd altered from a pair of Hollis's taken in at the waist, cuffed at the ankles. A long-sleeved cotton shirt because even in July, the rock chips could cut bare skin like glass fragments. She pinned her hair under a cloth and drank a cup of water from the second to last gallon jug in the kitchen. Each sip measured, each swallow deliberate, the way you drink when water has become something you count. She carried the tools to the marked spot and stood over the ground. The sycamore was a silhouette above her in the pre-dawn darkness, its leaves motionless, its roots somewhere below, reaching toward whatever it was that kept the tree alive while everything else on the ridge was dying. She swung the pick. The first strike broke the surface crust, dry soil pale, and cracked the dead skin of a landscape that hadn't seen rain in weeks. She swung again. The soil loosened and she shoveled it into the bucket, hauled the bucket up on the rope, dumped it in a pile, lowered the bucket, swung the pick again. This was the work. This was all of it. There was no other way and no shortcut and no machine that could help. A well is not built, a well is dug. By a person in a hole with a pick and a shovel, one strike at a time, one bucket at a time, 1 foot at a time, going down into the earth while the sun comes up and the heat comes on and the world above the hole goes about its business. The first 10 feet were soil and weathered limestone, the soft, rotten rock that forms on the surface of Ozark ridges where frost and rain have broken down the stone over thousands of years. Easy digging by local standards. The pick broke the rock. The shovel moved the pieces. The bucket carried them up. Clara found a rhythm. Swing, break, shovel, haul. Swing, break, shovel, haul. The rhythm came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, as if the motion of swinging steel into stone were something encoded in her body, passed down through Emmett's hands, and his father's hands, and his father's hands before that. 3 generations of Hadleys had stood in holes like this one, in rock, like this rock, doing exactly this work. Clara's muscles were learning what her ancestors' muscles had known. She hauled 10 loads per foot, 100 loads per day. Each load was a 5-gallon bucket full of broken rock and clay, 30 pounds of debris pulled hand over hand on a rope from a hole that got deeper every hour. 3,000 pounds per day. Lifted by a woman who weighed 120, her hands blistered by noon on the first day, the soft skin between her thumb and forefinger splitting open against the hickory handle of the pick. By the end of the second day, the blisters had torn and bled and reformed. By the end of the first week, her palms were calloused, the skin thick and hard, the hands of a well digger. She lined the walls as she went. Dry stacked limestone, the same technique Emmett had used, fitting flat stones together in a circular pattern without mortar, locked in place by geometry and gravity. Each stone placed carefully, each ring checked for stability, the shaft growing downward as the walls grew upward, a permanent cylinder, 4 feet in diameter, that would hold its shape when the digging was done. By the end of the first day, she was 4 feet down. By the third day, 10 feet. The soil was gone. The soft rock was gone. The shaft was clean and round, and the walls were solid, and the light from the surface made a bright circle above her that got smaller every foot she descended. At 12 feet, she hit the dolomite, the hardest rock in the Ozarks. Dense crystalline, formed 400 million years ago at the bottom of a shallow sea and compressed by time and pressure into stone that is for practical purposes nearly as hard as concrete. The pick bounced off it the way a fist bounces off a wall. Each strike sent a shockwave up the hickory handle through her wrists, through her forearms, into her shoulders and her spine and her teeth. Each strike removed a chip of stone the size of a quarter, sometimes the size of a dime. Sometimes the pick hit and nothing came free at all, and she swung again and again and again until a chip broke loose and fell to the floor of the shaft, and she scooped it into the bucket with all the other chips, each one a small victory against 400 million years of lithification. Progress dropped from a foot a day to 6 inches, then to 4 inches, then to 3. At 3 inches a day, she was gaining a foot every 4 days. The shaft was 12 feet deep, and she needed to reach 30, maybe deeper. At this rate, she was looking at 2 months of work. 60 days of swinging a pick at dolomite in a 4-foot cylinder in July, the neighbors knew. The sound of a pick striking dolomite carries across an Ozark hollow the way a church bell carries across a valley. A high, sharp, ringing tone, metal on crystalline stone, a frequency that travels through the clear air and bounces off the bluffs and reaches the gravel road half a mile away. From dawn to dark, the ringing went on, a rhythm, a pulse, the heartbeat of a woman in a hole hitting rock. Men driving past on the county road heard it before they saw the farm. They saw the growing pile of gray rock chips beside the hole, the rope and bucket, the tools laid out on a canvas tarp. Some stopped their trucks and walked over and looked down into the shaft and saw Clara at the bottom, 4 feet of woman against 400 million years of stone, and they shook their heads. Boyd Nolan was the nearest neighbor. Half a mile down the hollow, 60 acres of cattle land that was as dry as Clara's. He drove past every day on his way to check his stock tanks, which were empty, and his pasture, which was brown. He was a lean man with a face like old leather and the careful politeness of someone who believes it's not his business How another person chooses to fail. He stopped his truck on the fifth day. Clara. Russell Thorne drilled 3 holes to 200 feet. There's no water on this ridge. Clara was 20 feet below him, resting between swings, her shirt dark with sweat, rock dust in her hair, the pick across her knees. Russell drilled. I'm digging. Those are different things. How are they different? His bit is 6 inches. My shaft is 4 feet. In karst geology, that's the difference between missing the water and finding it. Boyd thought about that. He was a practical man. He understood the difference between a keyhole and a window. But he also understood that a window in a dry rock shows you dry rock, and every piece of evidence available said the rock on this ridge was dry. He shook his head. He drove on. He came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for 5 weeks. Watching, waiting for Clara to quit. She didn't quit. Dale Prescott heard about it at the feed store in Eminence. Dale sold John Deere equipment and farm supplies and information, the last being the commodity he moved in the greatest volume. He told the story to every farmer who walked through his door. Widow Hadley is digging a well by hand on that ridge Russell Thorne said was dry. She's down past 15 feet into solid dolomite with a pick and a bucket, doing it alone. In July, I give it another week before she comes to her senses. What if she hits water? She won't hit water. Russell drilled 3 holes. The ridge is dry. The geological survey confirms it. She's swinging a pick at rock that's been dry since the Devonian. Russell drilled 6-inch holes. She's opening a 4-foot shaft. 4 feet of dry rock is still dry rock, Dale said, and the men in the feed store laughed because it sounded like common sense. And common sense is what people call the things they believe without examining. Jesse watched his mother leave the house every morning before dawn and come back every evening after dark. She ate supper with her hands trembling from the vibration of the pick. Her palms were calloused, cut calloused again on top of the cuts. Her shoulders were knotted into ropes of tension that she couldn't loosen. Her back ached from 12 hours of bending and swinging in a space 4 feet wide. He wanted her to stop. He wanted to say what Boyd had said and Dale had said, and everyone in Shannon County was saying that Russell Thorne was right and the ridge was dry and she was going to hurt herself or worse at the bottom of that hole alone in July in the heat, while the county shook its head and waited for the inevitable. But he didn't say it because he could see something in his mother's eyes that he'd never seen in anyone's eyes before. Not desperation, though that was part of it. Not stubbornness, though that was there too. Something between the two. Something that burned steady like a coal in a banked fire, not flaring, not dying, just glowing with a heat that came from somewhere deep and wouldn't go out. He was 16 and didn't have a name for it yet. He would later. He'd call it conviction. The kind that doesn't come from being certain you're right. The kind that comes from refusing to surrender when you might be. Jesse started helping. Not because he believed there was water, because his mother was in a hole alone. He went to the well site after his morning chores. At first, he just sat on the rim of the shaft and watched. Then he started hauling the bucket when Clara filled it, pulling the rope hand over hand, dumping the load on the pile, lowering the bucket back down. Then he started bringing water, a jar of the precious ration stuff from the kitchen, lowered on the rope to the bottom of the shaft, where the air was still and thick, and a person could pass out from heat if they weren't careful. He didn't say he believed. He didn't say he thought she was right. He just hauled the bucket. And Clara accepted his help with a nod and no wasted words because at the bottom of a hole in the dolomite, there was no room for anything that wasn't the work. On the 19th day at 22 feet, the storm came. It came at night. The way Ozark storms come in drought, years sudden and violent, as if the sky had been saving its fury for the moment when it could do the most damage. Thunder split the darkness. Lightning turned the ridge white, and rain fell. Not the gentle soaking rain the county had been praying for. A deluge, sheets of water slamming the dry ground so hard the droplets bounced. The shaft filled, water poured over the rim and cascaded down the walls and hit the bottom and started rising. 22 feet of carefully dug well, 5 weeks of work filling with muddy storm water that was never meant to be there. The water hit the dry, stacked walls and the pressure built, and the stones that Clara had fitted so carefully, locked by geometry and gravity, began to shift. Clara heard it from the house. Not the rain, though the rain was loud enough to shake the windows. The sound beneath the rain, a low rumbling, stone moving against stone, the sound of failure. She ran. Out the door, across the yard, down the slope, to the well site in her nightclothes barefoot, the rain hitting her so hard she could barely see. She reached the shaft and dropped to her knees and looked down, and saw nothing but black water and loose stone. A section of the north wall 10 feet down had buckled inward under the pressure of the waterlogged soil behind it. 20 square feet of stacked limestone had collapsed into the shaft, filling it to the 18-foot mark with rubble. 5 days of digging. Buried. If she'd been in the shaft, she'd be under it. Jesse was behind her. He'd followed her from the house running barefoot in the rain, and he stood beside her looking down into the ruined well, and she could feel his fear without looking at him. Not fear of the storm, fear of the thing he'd been afraid of since the day she'd picked up the tools. That the hole was going to take her the way the tractor had taken his father. They stood in the rain until the storm passed. It passed the way it came suddenly, the thunder rolling east toward the river, the clouds breaking, the stars reappearing one by one, as if the sky were remembering what it looked like. The shaft was a dark pool below them, still and dirty, the rubble invisible beneath the water. Clara went back to the house, sat at the kitchen table in her wet nightclothes. Jesse made coffee on the stove and set a cup in front of her and sat across from her and waited. He was good at waiting. He'd learned it from Hollis, who'd been a patient man, and from Clara, who was not patient but understood the value of silence when there was nothing useful to say. "What are you going to do?" Jesse asked. "Clear the rubble. Fix the wall. Keep digging." "Mama." "What?" "You were almost in that shaft when it came down. If you'd been working late, if you'd been down there when the rain started." "I wasn't. Next time you might be." Clara looked at her son across the kitchen table. He was 16 and terrified. Not of the drought or the empty cistern or the cattle. Terrified of losing her. Terrified of being alone on 160 acres of dry ridge with nobody left, the last Hadley standing 17 years old with a dead father and a dead mother and a dry well that everybody had told her not to dig. She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "I'm not going to die in that hole. Your grandfather dug 50 wells and never lost a day to a collapse. He taught me how to brace a shaft and read the stone and know when the wall needs reinforcement. I got careless. I built the wall for dry conditions and didn't account for the possibility of sudden water. I won't make that mistake again." Jesse looked at her hand on his. It was small, scarred, calloused, cut across the knuckles where the rock had bitten, and it was the strongest hand he'd ever held. He didn't say what he wanted to say, which was, "Please stop." He said what he could say, which was, "Let me help." The next morning they started clearing the rubble together. Jesse lowered himself into the shaft for the first time, standing in knee-deep water among the fallen stones, handing them up to Clara one by one. The stones were heavy, 50 and 60 pounds each, slick with mud, and Jesse's hands were soft and the water was cold and the work was miserable and slow. But he did it. Hour after hour, stone after stone, because his mother was in a fight with the earth and he was done standing at the top watching. It took 3 days to clear the rubble and another 2 to rebuild the wall section. Clara doubled the thickness of the entire shaft lining this time, fitting each stone twice as carefully, checking every ring with the carpenter's level Hollis had kept in the barn. She built drainage channels into the wall at 4-foot intervals, gaps in the stone that would allow external water pressure to equalize instead of building up behind the wall. Emmett had taught her this too, though she hadn't remembered it until the collapse forced her to. "The knowledge comes when you need it," Emmett used to say. "It's all in there. It just waits for the right moment." By the time they were back to 22 feet, a full week had been lost. But the wall was stronger now, and Jesse was in the shaft with her, and that changed everything. On the 26th day of digging at 20 feet, the dolomite changed. The color shifted. Uniform gray became gray, laced with white streaks. Calcite veining. Mineral deposits left by water that had once moved through the rock, dissolving calcium carbonate from the limestone and redepositing it in the fractures as the water chemistry changed over geological time. The veins were thin, some no wider than a pencil line, but they laced through the dolomite in a branching pattern that looked to Clara's eyes like a map of ancient rivers, roads that water had traveled 1,000 years ago, or 10,000, or 100,000, etched into the stone in white crystal. The rock was still dry, the calcite was old, but the veins were a message from the geological past written in mineral ink, and the message said, water was here. Water found these fractures and used them as pathways. The question was whether it still did. Clara dug with renewed energy. Not because the rock was softer. The dolomite was as hard as ever, the pick bouncing, the chips flying small and sharp. But the calcite veins gave her something the human body converts to fuel more efficiently than food or water or rest. Hope is the most calorie-dense substance on Earth. It weighs nothing and it powers everything, and you cannot buy it or borrow it or steal it. You can only find it in the white streak of a mineral vein in gray rock at the bottom of a 20-foot hole that everyone says is dry. At 24 feet, she found the first fracture. A crack in the dolomite running roughly north to south, 2 inches wide, extending through the full width of the shaft. The fracture was lined with clay and fine gravel, the sedimentary residue of water flow. Particles that had been carried by moving water and deposited in the crack when the flow slowed or stopped. The clay was red and the gravel was smooth, and they told a story that any hydrologist would have recognized instantly. This fracture had carried water, significant water, enough to transport sediment. The fracture was dry at this depth, but when Clara knelt in the shaft and pressed her bare hand against the clay inside the crack, it was cool, not cold, cool, several degrees cooler than the surrounding rock. She held her hand there for a long time, feeling the temperature with her skin the way her father had taught her, because a thermometer measures degrees, but a hand measures something else, something closer to presence. The coolness was moisture, not flowing, not visible, but there, moving somewhere below. Not here, not yet, but close. Close enough to change the temperature of the clay in a fracture at 24 feet. She dug through the fracture and kept going. Jesse hauled the bucket above, pulling the rope, hand over hand without being asked, pouring the debris on the pile, lowering the bucket back down. He'd stopped asking if there was water. He'd started watching for the signs himself, though he didn't know he was doing it. Looking at the rock face as the bucket came up, looking for changes, looking the way Clara looked, the way Emmett had looked, the way 3 generations of Hadleys had looked into rock and seen what the rock was hiding. Below the fracture, the dolomite changed again, darker, denser, and when Clara struck it with the pick, the sound changed. The sharp ring of dry stone became a muffled thud, not the sound of hard rock, the sound of heavy rock, saturated rock, rock that was holding moisture in its pores, in its microfractures, even though nothing was flowing, nothing was dripping, nothing was visible to the eye. Wet rock sounds different from dry rock, the way a living body sounds different from a dead one. There is a resonance, a density, a fullness to the impact that tells you something is there even when you can't see it. Jesse heard it from above. He stopped hauling and leaned over the shaft and looked down at his mother in the dimness, 26 feet below the surface, her headlamp casting a yellow circle on the rock face. What was that sound? The rock changed. Changed how it's wet. Not flowing, not yet, but wet. I can hear it in the strike. Jesse said nothing. He hauled the next bucket. But something had shifted in his face. The careful skepticism, the 16-year-old's conviction that experts know more than mothers and machines know more than trees, was cracking. Like calcite in dolomite, a vein of something new running through the gray certainty of what he believed. On the 37th day at 28 feet, Clara's pick struck something that sounded different from everything she'd hit in the previous 5 weeks. A hollow thud, not the ring of solid stone, not the dense thud of wet stone, a hollow sound resonant and strange, like tapping the side of an empty barrel, like knocking on a door and hearing the room behind it. The sound of a void, the sound of space behind the rock face. She struck again. Same sound. The hollow resonance of something waiting behind a wall of stone. She called up to Jesse. He was at the rim of the shaft, sitting on the edge, his legs dangling into the darkness, the rope in his hands. Something's behind this rock, what I don't know yet. She struck a third time. The pick punched through, and the world opened. Water came through the hole in the rock face like a living thing, not a seep, not a trickle, a pressurized flow that shot through the opening with the force of something that had been trapped in darkness for longer than anyone had been alive, and was suddenly violently free. It hit Clara in the chest and knocked her back against the opposite wall of the shaft, and for a moment she couldn't breathe, not because of the impact, but because of the cold. The water was cold, spring cold, underground cold. The temperature of water that has been sitting in a fracture in the dolomite for years, insulated from the sun and the season's 48 degrees in the middle of July. It filled the bottom of the shaft in seconds. 2 inches, 4 inches, 6 inches, rising. Clara dropped the pick. It disappeared under the water. She grabbed the wall and started climbing, hand over hand, fingers gripping the gaps between the dry, stacked stones, boots slipping on wet rock, the water splashing up from below, rising faster than seemed possible for a space 4 feet wide. Jesse saw the water before he understood it. He was looking down into the shaft, and the darkness at the bottom was changing, becoming reflective, becoming liquid. And then he heard it, the sound of rushing water in an enclosed space, and he understood. He dropped flat on his stomach at the rim of the shaft and extended both arms down, and Clara reached up and grabbed his wrists, and he pulled. She was soaking wet and heavy with water, and the rim of the shaft was slick with overflow, and for a terrible moment neither of them moved, Clara dangling, Jesse straining the water, climbing the shaft below her like something alive and hungry. Then she was up, over the rim, rolling onto the ground, lying on her back in the dry grass, gasping, soaking wet, staring at a July sky that hadn't produced a drop of rain in months, while cold spring water from 30 feet underground soaked through her clothes and pooled around her body. She turned her head and looked into the shaft. The water was rising. She could see it, a dark circle climbing the stone walls, covering the fracture zone at 28 feet, filling the cylinder that she'd spent 5 weeks carving out of dolomite with a pick and a bucket. The flow was strong. 2 gallons per minute at least, pouring from an opening in the rock that she'd made with 3 swings of a pick, and the opening was small, maybe 6 inches across, and the flow showed no sign of slowing. She'd hit a pressurized aquifer. Not the regional water table that Russell Thorne's maps showed at 400 feet below the surface. A perched aquifer, a pocket of groundwater trapped in a fracture zone above an impermeable dolomite layer, sealed from above and below by dense rock, pressurized by the weight of the ridge above it. The water had been accumulating in this fracture system for years, decades, maybe centuries. Rainfall percolating down through the shallow soil, finding the fractures, following the cracks, pooling above the impermeable layer, building pressure, with nowhere to go and no way out. Until Clara's pick punched through the last inch of stone between the fracture and the shaft. The water was 30 feet below the surface, in a fracture 18 inches wide. Russell Thorne's 6-inch drill bit had passed through solid rock on both sides of the fracture, 4 feet away on his closest hole, and never touched it, never knew it was there. His instruments had told him the ridge was dry because his instruments had looked through keyholes and seen the wall on either side of the door. Clara had opened the door. 4 feet. That was the difference between a drill bit's 6-inch diameter and a hand-dug shaft's 4-foot diameter. The difference between a needle and a window. The difference between there is no water on this ridge and a spring that would flow at 2 gallons per minute, 2,880 gallons per day for the next 25 years without stopping. The water reached the lip of the shaft and spilled over. It ran downhill across the dry grass of the northwest slope, cutting a narrow channel in the baked earth, the first free-flowing water on Clara Hadley's ridge since April. The channel widened, the flow steadied. Within an hour, there was a stream where no stream had been that morning, running through the pasture toward the low ground, pooling in a natural depression at the base of the slope. The cattle found it before anyone else did. 28 head of gaunt Herefords, their ribs showing their coats, dull animals that had been surviving on hauled water and morning dew for months, lifted their heads in the near pasture. They could smell it. Water, running water, the smell of life in a landscape of death. They turned toward the slope and began to walk, then trot, their heavy bodies gaining speed, their hooves pounding the dry ground, and they gathered at the pool at the base of the slope and drank. Clara lay on the ground beside the well and listened to the sound of her cattle drinking from a spring that every expert and every instrument and every map had said didn't exist. And she cried. Not the careful, measured tears she'd allowed herself of at Hollis's funeral, the grief of a woman who still had work to do and couldn't afford to come apart. These were different. These came from the same place the water came from, deep and pressurized, and held back for so long that when they broke through, there was no controlling them. She cried for Hollis, who should have been here to see it. She cried for Emmett, who'd known it was there all along. She cried for the 6 weeks of swinging a pick at rock in July while the county waited for her to quit, And the bank waited to buy her land, and the cattle stood in the shade with their heads down and everything she had balanced on a dead man's voice telling her to trust a tree. Jesse sat beside her in the mud. He was 16. He didn't understand everything he was seeing, but he understood that his mother had dug 30 feet of dolomite by hand because a sycamore tree told her there was water, and she'd believed it, and she'd been right. He put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The water flowed, the cattle drank, the sycamore stood over the wellhead, its leaves moving in the evening breeze, and if the tree could have spoken, it would have said what Emmett Hadley had said 40 years ago on an October morning when the frost was melting along a line that nobody else could see. I told you, the water was here. It was always here. You just had to listen. The news moved through Shannon County the way water moves through limestone, finding every crack, reaching every corner. Boyd Nolan was the first outsider to see the well. He'd been driving past the Hadley place every day for 5 weeks, watching the pile of rock chips grow, waiting for the inevitable surrender. The sensible outcome. The outcome the county had agreed upon over coffee and conversation, and the comfortable certainty that Russell Thorne knew his business, and the ridge was dry, and the widow Hadley was digging her own grave literally in the July heat. Instead, on a Tuesday afternoon in late August, Boyd came around the curve in the gravel road and saw water. It was pouring over the lip of the shaft and running downhill into the pasture, cutting a channel through ground that had been brown and dead an hour earlier, creating a stream where no stream had ever been. The cattle were gathered at the bottom of the slope, belly deep in a pool of clear spring water, drinking with the slow contentment of animals experiencing relief after prolonged suffering. Boyd stopped his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring through the windshield, recalibrating what he thought he knew about Clara Hadley, and about ridges, and about the difference between what the instruments say and what the truth is. He got out and walked to the well. Clara was sitting on the ground beside the shaft. She was covered in limestone dust and mud. Her clothes soaked, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking like a woman who'd been in a fight with the earth and won on points. You hit water, I hit a spring on this ridge. Clara looked at him, not with triumph, with the tiredness that comes after a long effort when the adrenaline fades, and what's left is the simple fact of what you've done and the simple weight of what it cost. Perched aquifer, she said. Fracture zone at 30 feet. Russell's drill missed it because the fracture is 18 inches wide and his bit is 6 inches. He went through solid rock on both sides and never touched it. Boyd looked at the water flowing out of the shaft. Clear, cold, steady. He knelt beside the well and dipped his hand in the overflow, and the water was cold enough to make him pull his hand back. Spring water, groundwater, not surface runoff, not storm water, not the temporary gift of a passing rain. This was water from the rock itself, from the bones of the ridge, and it was flowing at a rate that said it was not going to stop. How much, Boyd asked? 2 gallons a minute, maybe more once the shaft fills completely and the pressure stabilizes. 2 gallons a minute is 2,800 gallons a day. I know what it is. It's enough for the cattle, the garden, the house, and the neighbors. Boyd was quiet for a long time. He was a man of few words in the best of circumstances, and these were not the best of circumstances for a man who'd spent 5 weeks believing his neighbor was crazy. I've been watching you dig for 5 weeks, he said. I drove past every day. I thought you were going to kill yourself in that hole. I thought you were out of your mind with grief and stubbornness, and I felt sorry for you, and I never once considered the possibility that you were right. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. The water was answering for her, flowing out of the shaft and down the slope and into the pool where the cattle drank a continuous response to 5 weeks of doubt from every direction. You weren't crazy, Boyd said. It wasn't a question. No, I was reading the ridge. My father taught me. His father taught him. Boyd looked at the sycamore standing above the well, tall and green, its roots disappearing into the ground near the shaft. A tree that had been marking the location of the water for decades while everyone walked past it without asking what it knew. That tree told you where to dig that tree. The frost pattern in January, the seep on the outcrop below. Water leaves tracks. You just have to know what you're looking at. Boyd nodded slowly. He looked at the sycamore for a long time. Then he got in his truck and drove home and didn't say anything to anybody for 2 days, because some things take that long to settle in a man's mind. Within a week, everyone in Shannon County knew. The story moved through Eminence and Winona and Birch Tree and Summersville the way all stories move through small Ozark towns, gaining detail at every retelling. The widow Hadley dug a well by hand, hit a spring at 30 feet. Flowing water on a ridge Russell Thorne drilled dry. Some told it as a miracle. Some told it as luck. Some told it as stubbornness rewarded. Dale Prescott told it at the feed store with the careful neutrality of a man trying to pretend he hadn't been mocking her for 5 weeks. Nobody told the story as what it actually was, which was science. Old science. The science of 3 generations of well diggers who'd watched the land and listened to what it said and passed the knowledge down the way water passes through limestone, finding every crack, reaching every depth, invisible to anyone who doesn't know where to look. Russell Thorne heard about it at a gas station on Route 19. The attendant mentioned it while cleaning his windshield. "Did you hear about the Hadley well, that ridge you drilled last month? She dug a well by hand and hit a spring." Russell didn't believe it. He heard it again at the hardware store in Eminence. A farmer buying fence wire told him the story. "The spring is flowing at 2 gallons a minute, steady, cold. Cattle are drinking right out of the overflow." Russell didn't believe it until he drove out to the Hadley farm and saw the water with his own eyes. He arrived on a Friday morning 3 days after Clara hit the spring. He parked his truck beside the well and got out and stood at the lip of the shaft and looked down. 4 feet in diameter, 30 feet deep. Dry stacked limestone walls, doubled reinforced drainage channels visible at regular intervals. Water flowing from a fracture zone clearly visible at the 28-foot mark, a dark opening in the gray dolomite, 18 inches wide, water pouring from it with the steady pressure of a system that had been building force for years. He checked the flow with a 5-gallon bucket in his watch. 2 gallons per minute, steady, cold. Crystal clear the way only limestone-filtered groundwater is clear, with a mineral taste that said this water had been in contact with dolomite for a long time. "This isn't possible," Russell said. He wasn't angry. He was confused in the way that a professional is confused when the evidence in front of him contradicts everything his education and experience and instruments have told him for 20 years. He wasn't defending his drill. He was trying to understand how his drill had missed what Clara's pick had found. "I drilled 3 test holes on this ridge," he said. 200 feet each, 600 feet of test drilling. I hit solid dolomite fractured limestone and 0 water. I checked the geological surveys. I checked the aquifer charts. Every piece of data I had said this ridge was dry." "Where did you drill top of the ridge?" "Flat ground. Best access for the rig. The geological survey shows the most likely aquifer zone under the flat areas where the maps told you to drill." Russell stopped. "Yes." Clara pointed at the fracture zone visible in the shaft wall, the dark opening from which the water flowed. "This isn't the regional aquifer," she said. "The regional water table is at 400 feet, just like your maps show. This is a perched aquifer. Groundwater trapped in a fracture zone above an impermeable dolomite layer at 30 feet. The regional maps don't show perched aquifers because they're too small and too localized to appear on a county-scale survey. They exist in the spaces between what the maps can see." Russell walked around the well. He was thinking. The professional in him was recalculating, re-examining the geological model he'd carried in his head for 20 years, looking for the gap, the blind spot, the piece he'd missed. "Where did you dig?" he asked. "Northwest slope, below the ridgeline. 200 feet from where you drilled one." "Why there the sycamore?" Clara pointed at the tree. "That tree has been growing on this slope for decades. Sycamores need deep, reliable moisture. A sycamore on a dry ridge means the ridge isn't dry below the surface. The frost pattern in January showed the fracture line. The seep on the outcrop confirmed the water was moving. My father called it reading the ridge. His father taught him. They'd been finding water this way in the Ozarks since the 1850s. Russell looked at the sycamore. He looked at the seep, the dark stain on the outcrop below the well, still visible, still damp. A signpost that had been there for years while Russell drove past on the county road and never noticed. He worked it out. Standing beside the well, looking at the slope, thinking about the geology, the way he'd been trained to think, but with new information. Information from a tree. My drill holes were on the flat top, he said. The impermeable layer dips toward the valley. On the flat top, the impermeable layer is above the fracture zone. Water drains off before it can accumulate. On the slope, the impermeable layer is below the fracture zone. The water gets trapped. That's why the sycamore is on the slope and not on the top. The water is on the slope and not on the top. My father knew this, Clara said. He didn't use the word geology. He said, watch where the trees grow. Russell was quiet for a long time. The sound of the water filled the silence, flowing out of the shaft and down the hill, steady and continuous. The sound of a thing that was going to keep flowing, whether anyone was there to hear it or not. I owe you an apology, Russell said. I told you this ridge was dry. I told you the geology didn't allow water here. I was reading the map. You were reading the land. The map was wrong. The map wasn't wrong. The map was incomplete. It showed what the geologists could measure from the surface and from drill cores. It didn't show what a sycamore root can find at 30 feet, because nobody ever asked the sycamore. Russell laughed. It was a genuine laugh, unforced, the sound of a man being taught something by a person he'd underestimated and having the grace to find it funny instead of humiliating. Nobody ever asked the sycamore, he repeated. I'm going to remember that, Mrs. Hadley, for the rest of my career. Every time I set up my rig, I'm going to look around for the sycamore first. My father would have been glad to hear that. They stood beside the well for a while longer, the driller and the farmer, the man who'd read the map and the woman who'd read the land, watching the water flow. Russell didn't apologize again. He didn't need to. He'd said it once, and once was enough between people who respected each other, which they did now in a way they hadn't before, because respect is earned in different currencies, and Clara had paid in the hardest one there is. Harlan Moss did not visit the well. He was not the kind of man who visited things that disproved his calculations. But he called the farm the following Monday, and Clara answered, and Harlan said he'd heard about the water situation and was pleased for her and that the bank considered her account in good standing and the purchase offer was withdrawn. Clara said thank you and hung up the phone. She did not say what she wanted to say, which was that Harlan Moss had tried to buy her farm for $6,000 while she was drowning in drought. And now the same farm with a flowing spring and a herd of recovering cattle and a vegetable garden that was already greening up under Jesse's watering was worth 3 times that and rising. She didn't need to say it. Harlan knew. Clara knew. The ledger was balanced in a way that no savings and loan arithmetic could capture. She paid the bank that fall. The garden produced through September with steady water from the well. The cattle gained weight. The fences got mended. Jesse went back to school in Eminence, and when the other boys asked what he'd done that summer, he said he'd hauled rock out of a well. His mother dug by hand, and they laughed, and he let them laugh, because laughter from people who don't understand is just noise. And Jesse Hadley had learned the difference between noise and signal that summer in a 4-foot shaft hauling buckets for a woman who listened to trees. That might have been the end of the story. A woman dug a well. She found water. The farm survived. A good ending, clean and satisfying, the kind you can tell at a feed store, and everyone nods and moves on to the next topic. But the Ozarks weren't finished testing Clara Hadley's well. In 1980, the drought came back, worse than 74, the driest year Shannon County had recorded since the Dust Bowl. The kind of drought that doesn't just kill crops, it kills hope. Every creek in the county was dry by May. Every cistern was empty by June. Wells that had produced reliably for decades, wells drilled by Russell. Thorne himself drilled to depth, cased in steel, pumped by electric motors, dropped below pump depth as the regional water table fell, and kept falling. The water that was supposed to be there, the water the maps and the surveys and the geological charts all said would be there, retreated deeper into the stone and left the pumps sucking air. 14 farms in the county were hauling water, driving trucks to the state park campground at Round Spring, the only reliable source, filling tanks and drums and every container they could find at a cost of time and fuel and pride that was grinding families down to nothing. Men who'd never asked for help were waiting in line at a campground spigot beside tourists with coolers and canoes filling 50-gallon drums with water that came from a government well so they could drive it home and pour it into troughs for cattle that were worth less every week. Ranchers were selling stock at auction for a quarter of market value, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't watch the animals die. The auction barn in West Plains was running double sessions to handle the volume. The auctioneer's voice was the soundtrack of the drought, chanting prices that everyone knew were too low, moving cattle that everyone knew were too thin, clearing the books for farms that everyone knew were going under. Clara's well didn't drop. Not a gallon, not a fraction of a gallon. 2 gallons per minute, the same steady, cold, constant flow it had produced since the day she'd punched through the fracture 6 years earlier. The perched aquifer operated on a different time scale than the regional water table. It was recharged by rainfall that percolated through the ridge slowly over months and years, seeping down through the shallow soil, finding the fractures following the cracks, pooling above the impermeable dolomite layer. The drought reduced the recharge rate, but the aquifer itself held years of accumulated water stored in the fracture system, like money in a vault insulated by 30 feet of solid rock, from the surface evaporation that was killing everything above ground. The well was a savings account that couldn't be overdrawn because the deposits had been accumulating for longer than anyone had been alive to make withdrawals. Clara opened it to the community. She didn't make an announcement. She told Boyd Nolan, and Boyd told the Langston family in the valley, and the word spread the way word spreads in a county where everybody knows everybody and nobody has water. Within a week, 6 farms were drawing from Clara's well. They came with hoses and tanks and jugs. Boyd ran a garden hose from the overflow down to his property line. The Langstons drove a flatbed with a 500-gallon tank and filled it every 3rd day. 3 other families came with pickup trucks and 50-gallon drums, the same method Clara had used for 11 years before the well, driving the gravel roads carefully so the water wouldn't slosh out, taking home what they needed and coming back when they needed more. Clara set up a trough in the lower pasture below the natural pool where the overflow collected. She ran a gravity line from the wellhead to the trough, PVC pipe, and fittings from the hardware store, and the trough stayed full all day and all night, fed by the steady pressure of the perched aquifer, and 6 farms' cattle drank from it, in rotation driven over the gravel roads by farmers who 3 months earlier would have said Clara Hadley was crazy to dig a well on a ridge that Russell Thorne had declared dry. She didn't charge. Not a dollar. Not a favor. Not a barter. When Boyd tried to bring her a side of beef as payment, she said no. When the Langston family offered cash for the hose and fittings, she said no. When a farmer from Birchtree she didn't know drove 20 miles with empty containers and asked what it would cost to fill them, she said it would cost nothing because the water was free and had always been free, and the only price was the digging, and she'd already paid that. When anyone asked why she was giving away what she could sell, she said the same thing she'd said to Boyd the day the water came in. It's enough for the cattle, the garden, the house, and the neighbors. 6 farms survived the drought of 1980 on water from Clara Hadley's well. 6 families, 60 head of cattle, 3 vegetable gardens, 1 spring flowing at 2 gallons a minute from a fracture in the dolomite that a woman had found because she'd watched where a sycamore grew and remembered what her father had taught her on an October morning when she was 12 years old. Dale Prescott drove out to the farm in September. He parked his truck beside the well and got out and stood there for a while looking at the water, looking at the hoses snaking downhill to Boyd's property, looking at the trough in the lower pasture where cattle from 3 farms were drinking in the evening light. Dale Prescott had sold John Deere equipment in Shannon County for 20 years. He'd sold tractors and combines and hay balers and fence line tools, and he'd always known exactly what to say to a farmer about machinery and value and return on investment. He was a man who lived by the authority of manufactured solutions, who believed that every problem had a product that could fix it, and he'd spent 6 years believing that Clara's problem, the dry ridge, was proof that some things were beyond fixing. Now he was standing beside a fix that no machine had made, that no product had enabled, that consisted of nothing but a hole in the ground, dug by a woman with a pick and the knowledge of where to put it. Clara, he said. Dale, in '74 when you started digging, I told every man who walked into the feed store that you were crazy. I said Russell Thorne had drilled 3 holes and the ridge was dry. I said you were wasting your time and your strength. I said it was a matter of days before you'd quit. I remember, I heard it from 3 different people. I'm sure you did. And I was wrong, plainly and completely wrong. But that's not what I came to ask. He looked at the well, the flowing water, the hoses, the cattle. I want to know how you knew. Russell had the maps. Russell had the rig. Russell had 20 years. How did you know there was water here when all his equipment said there wasn't? Clara looked at Dale Prescott, the man who'd made her the county joke for 6 weeks, who'd told the story of her digging to every customer as a cautionary tale about widows and grief and misplaced stubbornness. She could have been angry. She wasn't. Anger is expensive, and Claire had spent her reserves on something more productive. I didn't know, she said. I believed. My father taught me to read the land, the trees, the frost, the seeps. Every sign pointed to water here. The signs don't lie, Dale. The maps might be incomplete. The drill might miss. The surveys might not see what's too small or too local to map. But a sycamore growing on a dry ridge doesn't lie about what its roots have found. You trusted a tree over a geological survey. I trusted what I could see over what someone drew on paper in an office in Rolla. The survey was made by people who never stood on this ridge. They mapped from above, from airplanes and offices and drill cores. My father read from below, from the ground, from the frost and the seeps and the trees. The land tells you what it has if you learn its language. Dale didn't answer. He nodded. He got in his truck and drove home past the state park where farmers who'd laughed at Clara were still filling tanks with rationed water, and the next morning he went to the feed store, and when a customer brought up the Hadley well, Dale Prescott didn't tell a joke. He said, she's watering 6 farms from that well, and left it at that. Some lessons don't close a man's mouth. They just change what comes out of it. Russell Thorne came back in 1985, 11 years after the dry verdict. He drove the same truck, though the drilling rig was on a new trailer now, and he parked in Clara's farmyard, and they sat on the porch and drank coffee and talked the way two people talk who've earned each other's respect through disagreement. I've changed how I site my drill holes, Russell told her. I still use the geological surveys. The maps are good for the regional picture. They tell me where the big aquifers are, the ones that supply whole towns. But before I drill on a farm, I walk the property the way you walk it. I look for the sycamores. I look for the seeps. I watch where the willows cluster and where the moss grows on rock faces where it shouldn't. I've moved my drill location based on vegetation indicators on 6 properties since '74. 4 of them hit water where the map said they wouldn't. Clara poured him more coffee. The coffee was made with water from the well, and Russell noticed the taste, clean and mineral and cold, the taste of dolomite-filtered spring water served hot on a fall morning on a porch that overlooked a ridge that Russell had once pronounced dead. You're reading the ridge, Clara said. I'm trying. I'm not as good at it as you. I didn't grow up with it. My father wasn't good at it when he started either. He learned from his father. Took him 20 years before he could read a hillside at a walk. The knowledge isn't instant. It accumulates, like the water in the rock. Russell smiled. Like the water in this rock. That's a good way to put it. My father said it. I just remembered it when I needed to. After the drought, farmers started coming to Clara. Not to hire her. She was a farmer, not a contractor. They came to learn, to understand the reading method, to walk their own ridges with Clara and learn to see what their fathers and grandfathers had once known before the drilling rigs came and the geological surveys came and the modern infrastructure of water finding made the old knowledge seem unnecessary and quaint and slightly embarrassing, the way all old knowledge seems embarrassing until the new knowledge fails. Clara taught 7 people to read the ridge between 1981 and 1990. She walked their properties with them slowly, the way Emmett had walked with her, pointing out the signs. The sycamores that grew where they shouldn't, the frost patterns that melted early, the seeps that stained the rock faces. She showed them how to choose a dig site, how to read the convergence of signs, how to judge the depth. 3 of the 7 hit water, perched aquifers in fracture zones at depths between 22 and 38 feet. 3 new hand-dug wells on ridges that professional drillers had declared dry. The other 4 dug dry holes which Clara had warned them was possible. The signs increase the odds, she told them. They don't guarantee the outcome. A sycamore means moisture below the surface. It doesn't always mean a spring. Sometimes the moisture is too diffuse to collect. Sometimes the fracture doesn't hold enough volume. Sometimes you dig and you find damp rock and nothing more, and you fill the hole and try again somewhere else. My father dug dry holes too, more than he dug wet ones. But 3 out of 7 is better than 0 out of 7, which is what you'll get if you only drill where the maps say to drill and ignore what the land is showing you. A professor from Missouri State University visited Clara's well in 1988, a hydrogeologist who'd heard about the reading method from a county extension agent and wanted to see it for himself. He spent 2 days on the ridge with Clara. She walked him through the signs, the sycamore, the frost data she'd recorded over the years, the seep patterns on the outcrops. He measured the flow rate. He tested the water chemistry. He mapped the fracture zone visible in the shaft wall. He took soil samples and rock cores and photographs and notes. He published a paper the following year. Perched aquifer detection using surface vegetation indicators in karst terrain. The paper described Clara's method in scientific terminology, translating 3 generations of empirical observation into the language of academic hydrology. It cited traditional Ozark well-finding methods as a surprisingly reliable technique for identifying fractured rock aquifer zones that conventional drilling misses. The paper was published in a regional geology journal and was read by approximately 40 people and changed nothing about how the State Geological Survey mapped aquifers in the Ozarks. Clara didn't mind. She hadn't dug the well to change science. She dug it to save her cattle and her farm and her son's inheritance, and the piece of ground where Hollis had lived and died, and where Emmett's knowledge passed down through her had found what Russell Thorne's rig had missed. The well was the point. The water was the point. Everything else was footnotes. Jesse took over the farm in 1995 when Clara was 72, and her hands couldn't grip the fence tools the way they used to, and her knees couldn't take the slope to the lower pasture without complaining. And the walk from the house to the wellhead 200 feet took longer than it used to, and gave her time to look at the sycamore and remember things she didn't need to remember because the tree remembered for her. He farmed the 160 acres with the same care and the same stubbornness and the same quiet competence that his mother and father had brought to the land. He used a modern tractor for the field work, a green one, because the John Deere franchise had outlasted Dale Prescott's retirement, and the new dealer was a younger man who'd never made fun of anybody's well. But Jesse kept the Farmall Super M in the barn, maintained it, changed the oil, kept the tires inflated. The tractor his father had farmed with, the tractor his father had died under. The tractor that had sat in the barn useless and silent while his mother dug 30 feet of dolomite by hand with a pick and a bucket and a knowledge that came from her father and her father's father. And the sycamore tree that stood over the wellhead like a monument to the things that maps can't show. The well was still flowing. 25 years after Clara hit the spring, the water came at approximately 1.88 gallons per minute. Slightly reduced from the original 2 gallons, a gradual decline that indicated the perched aquifer's recharge rate was falling slowly as decades of water were withdrawn. But still enough, still cold, still clear. Still flowing from the fracture at 28 feet through the hand-dug shaft with its dry-stacked walls and its reinforced drainage channels out over the lip and down the slope to the pool in the lower pasture, where Jesse's cattle drank the way Clara's cattle had drunk, the way Boyd, Nolan's cattle, and the Langston's cattle, and the cattle of 6 farms had drunk in the drought of 1980, when the well was the only thing standing between the hollow and ruin. Jesse's children called the sycamore the water tree. They climbed its branches, which were thick and low and perfect for children. They played in its shade on summer afternoons. They knew the story the way farm children know the stories of their land, not as history but as identity. The driller who said the ridge was drawnay, the grandmother who trusted a tree, the spring that saved 6 farms. The pick that was still in the barn hanging on the same nail where Clara had hung it after the well came in the hickory handle worn smooth by her grip, the steel head chipped and scarred by 5 weeks of striking dolomite. They asked Jesse about it sometimes. Why Grandma dug the well by hand when the driller said there was no water. Because the driller was looking with a machine, Jesse told them. Your grandma was looking with her eyes. The machine saw what it could see, which was a 6-inch hole through rock. Your grandma saw what the land was showing her, which was a sycamore growing where it shouldn't, and frost melting where it shouldn't, and water staining a rock where it shouldn't. The shouldn'ts are where the secrets are. That's what your great-grandfather knew. That's what he taught her. That's what she taught me. The children accepted this the way children accept the things their parents tell them, with belief and without full understanding, storing it in the part of memory that holds knowledge. You don't yet have a use for the part that opens when you need it, the way a fracture opens when a pick strikes the right spot. Clara Hadley died in 1999 at 76 years old. She dotted in the farmhouse in the bedroom she'd shared with Hollis for 9 years and slept in alone for 27. She dotted in the early morning before dawn, in the hour when the Ozarks are silent and the ridge holds its breath, and the only sound is the water flowing from the well, which didn't stop and wouldn't stop and was flowing at the moment of her death, the way it had been flowing every moment since the day she'd broken through the last inch of dolomite with the third swing of a pick, and the earth had opened and given her what she'd come for. The funeral was at the Baptist church in Eminence. The pews were full, every seat was taken, and men stood along the walls, and in the vestibule and out on the steps in the October sun, holding their hats, saying nothing the way Ozark men stand at funerals when the person being buried is someone they owe a debt they never repaid. Farmers from across the hollow, families she'd watered in the drought, men she'd taught to read the ridge, women who'd stood in her kitchen drinking coffee brewed with spring water from a well that everyone had said didn't exist. Jesse sat in the front pew with his wife and his children and looked at the coffin and thought about a 5-gallon bucket on a rope and the sound of a pick striking dolomite and the way his mother had cried when the water came the only time he'd ever seen her cry, and how the tears and the spring water had mixed together on the ground beside the well on a day in August when the world was dry and his mother was not. Russell Thorne was there. He'd driven from West Plains an hour and a half on winding roads through the Ozark Hills because some people deserve to be remembered by those they proved wrong. Russell was older now. His hair was white. His hands were slower. He'd semi-retired from drilling, turning the rig over to a younger man. He'd trained a man who walked every property before he drilled, who looked for the sycamores and the seeps and the frost patterns before he set the bit, because Russell had taught him to, because Clara had taught Russell. Russell spoke at the graveside. He stood beside the coffin in the October light, the same kind of light that Emmett Hadley had walked in when he'd taken a 12-year-old girl to read the ridges, and he told one story, the only story that mattered. He told about the summer of 1974, about the 3 dry test holes, 200 feet each, 600 feet of drilling that found nothing. About the day he'd told Clara Hadley that her ridge had no water and the geology didn't allow it, and she should sell the place or pipe water from the valley at a cost she couldn't afford. About the 5 weeks that followed, the sound of a pick on dolomite ringing across the hollow, the growing pile of rock chips, the county shaking its head. About the day he'd driven back and seen water flowing from a shaft that a woman had dug by hand 30 feet through solid rock 4 feet wide, hitting a spring that his $60,000 rig had missed by less than the length of his arm. He told about the sycamore, the frost pattern, the seep, the reading method that 3 generations of Hadleys had practiced before anyone in Shannon County had heard of a geological survey. He told about the phrase, "Nobody ever asked the sycamore," Russell said. He was looking at the coffin, speaking to Clara or to Emmett, or to the entire line of Hadleys who'd put their hands in Ozark dirt and listened to what the dirt said back. Clara taught me something I should have learned in engineering school but didn't, because they don't teach it in engineering school. She taught me that the land has water. The maps don't always know where, the drills don't always find it. The instruments measure what they're designed to measure and miss what they're not designed to see, but the trees know, the frost knows, the seeps know. And the people who watch the trees, the frost and the seeps, the people who learn the language the land speaks, they know what the trees know. He stepped back. The preacher said the final words. The prayers were spoken. The hymn was sung, and they lowered Clara Hadley into the limestone ground of Shannon County, Missouri, into the same karst geology that had held her water and her father's knowledge, and the bones of every Hadley who'd ever dug a well by hand in the Ozark Hills. She went into the ground the way the water went into the ground, finding the fractures filling the spaces, becoming part of the rock that had defined her life. Jesse drove home after the funeral. He parked in the farmyard and walked to the well and sat beside it in the October light and listened to the water. 2 gallons a minute, give or take. The sound of permanence. The sound of something that outlasts the person who found it, the way a spring outlasts the rain that feeds it, the way knowledge outlasts the mind that carries it, the way a sycamore outlasts every other tree on a dry ridge, because its roots go deeper than anyone can see. The sycamore stood above him, taller now than it had been in '74, its canopy wider, its roots thicker. The increased water flow from the exposed fracture had fed the tree for 25 years, and it had responded the way living things respond to abundance, by growing, by reaching higher, by spreading its branches wider against the sky, by becoming more of what it already was, which was a marker, a sentinel, a living sign that water was here and had always been here and would be here after everyone who'd ever doubted it was gone. Jesse put his hand on the bark. Cool. Even in October, the same cool his mother had felt when she touched the tree in July of '74 and understood what it was telling her. He told the story to his children that evening after supper, sitting on the porch in the dark while the ridge settled into silence and the water flowed and the sycamore's leaves rustled in a breeze that smelled like fall and stone and the particular mineral sweetness of spring water from deep in the rock. He told them about Emmett who'd walked the hills, about Clara who'd dug the well, about Russell who'd drilled 3 holes and found nothing and had the grace to come back and learn from the woman he'd told to quit, about the drought of '80 in the 6 farms and the cattle drinking from a pool that shouldn't have existed on a ridge that shouldn't have had water. He told them the question the story asks, which is the same question it has always asked. Who are you listening to? The person with the map in the machine, the instruments and the surveys and the professional authority who measures what can be measured and declares the rest non-existent, or the person standing in the dirt, looking at a tree that shouldn't be there, hearing what the land is saying, because someone taught them to listen. Russell Thorne's drill bit was 6 inches wide. It went through the rock like a needle through fabric, fast and precise, and it missed the water by 4 feet because a needle sees only what it touches. Clara Hadley's well was 4 feet wide. She opened the rock the way you tear fabric apart, slow, brutal. 6 weeks of striking dolomite with a pick in July, and she found a spring that had been waiting in the dark for longer than anyone had been alive, missed by 3 drill holes that passed within arm's reach of the fracture without knowing it was there. The driller trusted the map. The farmer trusted the land. The map showed what the geologist could measure. The land showed what the sycamore already knew. The well driller said there was no water. The farmer dug by hand and hit a spring at 30 feet. The sycamore had known all along. Nobody asked it until a woman with a pick decided to listen.